Welcome to Energize and Revitalize with Dr. Amy. I'm Dr. Amy Cooper-Smith, a doctorate-prepared nurse practitioner, and this show is about empowering you to live a radiant, healthy, and balanced life. I'm very excited to welcome back today's guest, Dr. Darren Peterson, bariatric surgeon and founder and CEO of Florida Coast Weight Loss Center. He and his wife, Candy Peterson, also own Fit Body Boot Camp. And Dr. Peterson is the medical director at Amethyst Wellness. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So I asked you to come on today. A couple weeks ago, we did a show here about the new dietary guidelines. And one of the controversies behind those guidelines is the recommendations regarding eating more full-fat dairy and more meat-type products. Mm-hmm. And so people are pretty upset about that. And I wanted to really get a good take medically from, someone with your experience. Should we be worried about saturated fat?
So this is an interesting topic. And obviously a lot of the current recommendations that you're seeing, not only from the political realms, but also inside the medical realms, is pushing back on a lot of the dogma that it's been in existence for 50, 60 plus years. And it's really interesting when you really start to go back and take a look at all this, because a lot of what we have just accepted as being common sense is now being questioned. And when you start to look at the history and start to understand, well, where did this all come from in the first place? There's shaky ground on a lot of that.
So what did happen? Why is saturated fat the bad guy?
Well, it goes back to the 1950s when we were starting to see a dramatic rise in the incidence of heart disease. And people were speculating as to exactly what happened and what was occurring that was causing that spike. And several people started speculating that it had to be nutritionally related. One of them was a gentleman named Ancel Keys. And Ancel Keys has a very interesting and sort of sordid past, in that he was an epidemiologist that first postulated that fats were what contributed to the development of cardiovascular disease. And amongst other things, he did a whole bunch of different studies. But one of the big studies that people talk about is a 7-country study. And basically what he did was he cherry-picked 7 countries that had a high incidence of heart disease, and he looked at their fat intake. And he came away with that with the belief that fat caused cardiovascular disease. And he started publishing that. The problem is when you start to look retrospectively at what he was doing, and I chose that word cherry picking because that's exactly what he did. He ignored countries that didn't fit his narrative. He came in with a preconceived idea of what was probably occurring and then chose a study to fit that narrative. Well, that kind of goes against the laws of investigation when you talk about medical research. The other problem was that he was doing epidemiologic studies, which can prove or can suggest a correlation, but they can't prove causation. So the way that epidemiologic studies are typically done is you will look at broad sweeps of things that are occurring and say, it appears that this seems to go along with this. But once you have that suggestion of correlation, then you need to design well-developed randomized studies to look at those questions and really drill down on that question to figure out, is there more than just a correlation, and is there really a causation? And when it comes to the world of fats and health and nutrition, that is an extremely difficult undertaking. And nobody really ever did it to any significant degree. There was suggestions and different studies that were done that sort of correlated it, but then other ones that didn't. And the problem was that he took all of that information and continued to push it forward in the literature in a very, very heavy-handed way. And it became sort of the rule. The next thing that happened was back in the 1960s, the American Heart Association jumped on board and they said, this has got to be one of the big issues. Saturated fat causes cardiovascular disease. And even though they still had no data to really prove it through randomized controlled studies, this became sort of the lay of the land. And this is what people believed, that fat made you fat, fat gave you cardiovascular disease.
Yeah, and I think a big problem that we have with nutritional studies for not just related to fat, but related to all the things we recommend to our clients, a nutritional study, it's almost impossible to really determine exactly what the people have eaten. for a few reasons.
Exactly. Not only is it difficult to determine what they eat, but even if you put them into an environment where you control what
Yeah.
they eat to a very strict degree, it's usually over the course of years and decades before you start to see the metabolic and the health related changes that occur. So trying to continue those studies for that period of time in a very strict sense is next to impossible.
Right.
And that's
Very
been
expensive.
very expensive and very, very difficult to complete.
Yeah, so I think it's difficult for researchers to, give, accurate data. But like you mentioned, I think it was really important to this individual to promote his agenda. And I even read that anyone who opposed him was just blacklisted. It was his way, or you don't practice anymore.
Yeah, he was, and apparently I've read a lot about him. Obviously, he's no longer living, but he was a very interesting individual that was very strong in his beliefs and heavily criticized and put down people that pushed back against what he was putting forward, which really is the antithesis of what we try to do in medicine. We try to keep an open mind with everything, and we approach it with an evidence-based approach. But that was not his approach. He wasn't a clinician. He was a researcher. And so he didn't have that same sort of mindset. And of course, this goes back 50, 70 years ago.
Yeah, so the American Heart Association adopted that premise that saturated fat causes heart disease and made a recommendation that less than 10% of our total daily calories should come from saturated fat. And by the way, that recommendation is still in place in the new guidelines. But the criticism is if people were to cook their food with butter and beef tallow and to eat the full fat dairy and the meats, it would be impossible to keep their total intake to 10%,
right?
Which is what the critics are saying. But so the American Heart Association, though, for years, like you said, decades, has held to this, and they're still recommending that.
Yeah, and I think there were several individuals that really started to question that belief, and it really came from the idea of just looking backwards. Before we had McDonald's on every corner, before we ate the pre-processed packaged food menu that we typically eat today, people didn't eat like that. They didn't have those things available. And consequently, we didn't see the degree of cardiovascular disease, of cancer, of obesity, all these other related issues. So it appears that as the Industrial Revolution took place, as the nutritional revolution took place, we started seeing a dramatic increase in the degree of these medical related issues. Now, some have tried to push that off and say, well, it was because our reporting wasn't nearly as good back then, and so that's why you see these. And there may be some truth to that, but in large part, I think you have to acknowledge that when you evaluate some of these other groups, the Inuit up in the Antarctica and different tribal groups in Africa that ate a very, very heavy nutritional daily intake of saturated fats, they didn't have these types of problems. So you at least have to start questioning, is our current thought process correct? Or is there something to why all these people ate the way that they did and didn't have problems? Yeah. One of the guys that we look at as far as our nutritional guidelines is a guy named Mark Sisson that wrote a book called The Primal Blueprint. And that was basically his premise. What did they eat before we had McDonald's on every corner? If you go back to the early days in the hunter-gatherer societies, they only had things that were available in season. So they ate berries and fruits when they were in season. They ate vegetables when they were in season. They ate meats and salmon when they were in season. They didn't eat the same thing all year round, and they may sometimes go days without eating. And so they had to eat in a way that would sustain them through those periods of not gaining nutrition. And when you really started evaluating it, you realized that their daily intake of fats was very, very different than what we recommend today.
Yeah, it goes back to eat real food, which definitely makes sense. But so when we talk about eating fat, what are the types of fats?
So this is one of the other things that I think people really need to start drilling down on. If this is an area that interests you, you can't be superficial with your understanding of this, that not all fat is created equal and that fats do different things in your body. There are basically three different types of fats. There are saturated fats, monounsaturated fats, and polyunsaturated fats. We won't get into the difficult biochemistry of it all, but it basically boils down to the number of double bonds that exist within that carbon chain. I've heard people describe it as if you have a long dinner table and you have a bunch of seats at the dinner table. If every seat at that dinner table is taken, that's what we call a saturated fat. If there's one seat that's left open, that's what we call a monounsaturated fat. There's one double bond that exists or one empty seat that exists. The more empty seats that exist, the less stable that oil is. And what you want is a very stable oil. As oils become unstable, they create all sorts of oxidation issues that wind up damaging cells and create cellular problems. So the more double bonds that you have, the more problem that you have. Well, that's what a polyunsaturated fat is two or more double bonds within that carbon chain.
Oh, that was a very good description. Like you used to be a professor, but that was excellent.
I didn't make that up, by the way.
Good. So a lot of our listeners would understand that a saturated fat might be something solid at room temperature, like lard and things like that, and then your oils, of course, fall into those other categories.
Mm-hmm. So saturated fats are primarily found in things like meat, butter, dairy, coconut oil, those types of things. Yep. And historically, we have looked at those, since the 1950s, as being those dangerous, those things that created cardiovascular disease and that fats made you fat. But again, that was based on very shaky science. And now we're beginning to understand that it's because those are very, very stable fats that they don't create some of the cellular problems that the more polyunsaturated fats do. And in fact, most of the polyunsaturated fats that we see in today's environment are produced in industrialized cooking plants. There are some that are naturally occurring, but most of these are ones that we create. There's an author that I like named Catherine Shanahan that's written several books on this subject. Her latest one is a book called Dark Calories, where she goes very heavy into understanding why polyunsaturated fats are so bad from a developmental stage with our kids, as they're having neurodevelopment, cognitive development, their immune system development, and how these oils can wind up affecting our kids as they're growing, but also even later on in life. It's interesting to know that she was actually the nutritional, I can't remember what they titled her exactly, but the nutritional counselor for the LA Lakers. Oh, cool. And one of the biggest things that she did was she basically eliminated all of the polyunsaturated fats from their diets. And they found that they, in a measurable way, were able to compete at a much higher level. They would do exercise-induced VO2 max, which looks at your oxygen consumption, and they found that those athletes that had removed those from their diets performed significantly better than they did before they had removed those from their diet.
So what are some examples of those unstable oils that people might find in their pantry?
So Catherine describes those as the Hateful Eight. And the Hateful Eight is basically a list of seed oils. I'm going to see if I can remember them all. From corn, canola, soy, safflower, sunflower. There's two other ones that I'm forgetting. But basically, they're all the small seed oils. The way that I remember them is the larger seeds, olive, coconut, avocado, yep. Those are cold pressed. They literally put them into a press and they squeeze the oil out of those seeds. Excuse me. The smaller seeds, like sunflower seeds, you can imagine the amount of oil that's in that seed and what you have to do to extract the oil out of it. They actually have to put those through very, very heavy heating processes and extraction processes using solvents, deodorizers, and all these things in order to extract the oils. And in doing so, they chemically alter the structure of those oils. And that's a big part of what makes them even less stable once we ingest them.
Are we doing that because it's cheaper? Or why are we having so much of this processed oil in our lives?
Well, again, it goes back to the Ansel Keys era when we thought that saturated monounsaturated fats were bad, and they started pushing and developing these polyunsaturated fats as a replacement. And that's why, and yes, they are cheaper. So all the vegetable oils are significantly cheaper, and they're used in most of your fast food restaurants, making French fries and whatever else are all cooked in these types of oils because they can use them over and over and over again. But of course, that's one of the things that just winds up getting infiltrated into whatever you're eating and begins to create that problem.
So it started maybe from a place of goodness, where we thought it was healthier for us. And then, of course, because it's cheaper, the industry likes it as well. Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to pause for a break from our sponsor. You're listening to Energize and Revitalize with Dr. Amy. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Energize and Revitalize with Dr. Amy. I'm Dr. Amy Cooper-Smith, and my guest today is Dr. Darren Peterson. So before the break, we were talking about the controversy of saturated fat and how it got the reputation that it has. And we were reviewing the different types of fats. So you had mentioned the different seed oils and the very polyunsaturated fats, and they're damaging to us because they can become chemically unstable with the way that they're processed.
Right. So again, we have been pushed away from animal fats, red meats, those types of things. We've been pushed away from using butter, tallow, lard. We've been pushed away from, except for in some circles, even things like too much monounsaturated fats with olive oils and those types of things, although they're obviously very heavy in Mediterranean type diets. And we've been forced into using more and more of the polyunsaturated fats, which come in all your ultra processed foods, your pastries and your chips and your cookies and anything that's packaged. If you turn over and read the label, almost all of them have one of those hateful 8 seed oils.
Yeah. Yep. Now, back to those earlier concerns about saturated fat. Does saturated fat increase our cholesterol levels, our serum cholesterol?
So this is one of the biggest issues is do these saturated fats increase your total cholesterol? And if so, does that contribute to cardiovascular disease?
Yeah.
Well, the answer is yes and no. Yes, these oils do change your total cholesterol. There's actually a push in the United States amongst some physicians, myself included, to getting reference labs to quit reporting total cholesterol. Oh. Reason being is total cholesterol in and of itself is an essentially meaningless number. That it's the evaluation of all the subparticles, your LDL, your HDL, your VLDL, your ApoB, and so on. And it's the ratios of those that we found are much more indicative of future cardiovascular events. So specifically your total cholesterol to HDL ratio, your triglyceride to HDL ratio is much more important than just total cholesterol by itself. And the problem is that many physicians that don't take the time to really review and evaluate these are slapping patients on medications to try to reduce their total cholesterol without really understanding what their true cardiovascular risk is. So do these different oils, do these different fats raise total cholesterol? Well, yes and no. Again, one of the things that we see is the polyunsaturated fats tend to raise your LDL levels over your HDL levels, while saturated monounsaturated fats do the opposite. They'll raise HDL levels over LDL levels. Now, traditionally, we've looked at LDL as being the bad cholesterol and HDL being the good cholesterol, which is also really kind of an outdated nomenclature because it's more complicated than that. So you really have to understand the details rather than just saying, does it raise cholesterol levels?
Yeah, I've had clients maybe go to a ketogenic type diet and they do notice a slight bump in their serum cholesterol. And I've had other people not have that. So I always wonder if there's a genetic predisposition in some people that they do respond in that way. But again, the question is that what's causing heart disease?
Right. I think it's important to understand, first of all, that every cell in your body contains cholesterol. Cholesterol is part of the membrane that sits around the cell. And it's also involved in hormone production and lots of other different cellular functions within our body. So cholesterol is an incredibly important component. Over 80% of the cholesterol in your body is manufactured internally. And only about 20% of the cholesterol that's in your body is actually taken in through dietary sources. And interesting studies really show that even dramatic increases in foods that contain cholesterol have a minimal marginal effect on your cholesterol levels. So that really gets back to the question of, does dietary cholesterol contribute into any significant degree in cholesterol levels, and does that translate into cardiovascular risk?
Yeah, we've all known people that have, maybe a normal cholesterol or even a low cholesterol, and they have a heart attack. We're like, well, what happened? And many times they're also on a magic statin as well. So how does somebody, when we make that correlation, somebody has a normal cholesterol, but they just had a heart attack. So we know that that it's not just cholesterol that's causing the problem.
So we were again brought up to believe that cholesterol created this waxy substance inside your vessels that when it accumulated, it could create blockages that wind up resulting in a heart attack. We also now know that it's a lot more complicated than that. When they went back and started saying, well, fats don't really look like they're the main contributor to cardiovascular disease. It looks like there's a lot of other things, smoking being one of them, obesity, insulin resistance, all these other things. So it really kind of got back to the whole idea of inflammation, and that the inflammatory mediators were really what was causing vascular damage. Smoking is a prime one to look at because of the severe inflammatory response that smoking causes. So that's when they started looking at other reasons why people could create cardiovascular disease. Well, of course, there's a lot of pushback from the pharmaceutical industry. Why? Because they're making lots and lots of money off these medicines. In fact, it's kind of interesting to note that the reference range for cholesterol has decreased significantly over the last decade and more. Why? Well, because when you fall out of that range, you're now a candidate for these medications. Right. There are several interesting books. One of the ones that I point people towards is a book by a cardiologist named Asim Malhotra that wrote a book called A Statin-Free Life. And he outlines basically what we're talking about, asking the question of does cholesterol and does increased cholesterol levels really result in cardiovascular disease? How does this cholesterol to HDL ratio really give you a better assessment of risk? And are there other things that will give you an indicator of whether you're at risk for cardiovascular disease? One of them being your coronary calcium score. So that's a radiologic study that looks at the degree of calcium inside the coronary arteries. And the higher that score, the more at risk that you truly are. And those are better assessments as to whether or not a statin is actually going to help you. He makes the argument that 90+% of people that are actually on statins probably shouldn't be on statins. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell people that they should get off their statin. I think that you should educate yourself. So reading books like this, A Statin-Free Life, is a great way to educate yourself. And then go have an intellectual conversation with your primary doctor to see whether or not he really feels after that conversation that statins are still necessary.
Yeah, I see people with really low cholesterol levels that are pharmacologically induced, and like too low, because like you said, we need cholesterol to make our hormones. Our brain needs cholesterol. So I think people are trying to protect themselves from heart disease, but maybe increasing their risk for dementia because they're not giving their brain what they need. So I really do hope that people start questioning of, is this the right thing for me?
Yeah, and I think we touched on this last time in that I'm very critical of a lot of modern day medicine, and there's a lot of reasons why it's gone in this direction. Reimbursements, insurance companies putting pressure on physicians to make certain numbers and margins. But we've created a Band-Aid medicine type approach where when patients have numbers that fall out of range, we just slap them on a medication. Right. Your blood pressure is high, here, take this pill. Your cholesterol is high, here, take this pill. Your glucose is high, here, take this pill. Rather than really understanding the underlying rationale as to why you've developed this problem and trying to deal with the underlying problem, we're just Band-Aiding the problem with medications.
Yeah, and you mentioned too that I think there's pressure on some providers in some instances to prescribe, whether they like it or not. And, I've seen and heard of providers being reported to their boards if they're not making certain recommendations, which, you go to school for all these years and you have all this education and opinion, but you're not allowed to give your opinion anymore.
We saw that most exemplified during COVID.
Yes.
That was a pretty sad day in the medicine world.
Yeah, I heard about providers being reported to their medical boards for not recommending vaccine, and 100% of the time. So it's an interesting world we're living in.
Truly is.
Yeah. So you mentioned triglycerides when we were talking about the cholesterol panel. So triglycerides, I think, are more interesting because they're not so much influenced by fat intake, but by sugar.
So that was another issue that we saw whenever we started making recommendations for people to decrease the amount of fat in their diet. Well, a calorie is nothing more than a unit measurement of energy. So your body needs a certain amount of energy to function optimally. And when you reduce one of the components that is that energy source, it has to be replaced by something. So what did it get replaced by? refined sugars,
Yes.
carbohydrates, processed foods. And it was the dramatic uptake in those types of things that really started creating a lot of the medical problems that we see today. Is one of the reasons why I'm glad to see our health department starting to reverse some of those things, turning the food pyramid upside down and stop recommending grains and pastas and breads and all these things as being a huge part of the American diet because of exactly this.
Yeah, if you look at the container of, a reduced fat dairy product, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there that like you said, because when you take the fat out, they have to replace it with something else. So there's a whole bunch of garbage in there that, and it's not better for us.
Right. So most of the energy stored inside fat is stored in the form of triglycerides. And so when people are initiating on a weight loss journey, they may see a bump in their triglycerides early on, but it's one that you can't just immediately respond and react to. You have to recognize that that's occurring because they're mobilizing a lot of these fat stores, and that down the road that will normalize as they continue to eat a very whole food directed diet and start eliminating the processed foods, eliminating all these hateful seed oils, eliminating sugars, refined sugars, and carbohydrates, and so on.
Yeah, so I think you've given a lot of small things that people can do. So if somebody out there is trying to negotiate the world of fat, should they eat it, should they not? What's something they can do to educate themselves?
There's lots of really good references out there. Probably one of the most interesting books that I've read in the last decade was written by an investigational reporter named Nina Teckholtz. And she wrote a book called The Big Fat Surprise. I will warn you, it's a really dry, really boring book. But she spent greater than 12 years documenting all this and really trying to understand and answer in depth a lot of these questions that we're talking about today in a very brief period of time. So that is a great book if you really want to have an understanding of how did we get to where we are today, and is there really any science to back that up? She answers a lot of those questions. Another one that I really like is Catherine Shanahan. She actually lives right over here in North Orlando area. So she's a local Floridian and has written several books. Two of the most recent books that she wrote, the most recent one is Dark Calories, where she really dives in deep into all the seed oils and why polyunsaturated fats are so bad, especially in kids and then all the way up through later adult years. But then the other one is a book called The Fat Burn Fix. And The Fat Burn Fix talks a lot about all these things as well, but she gives a lot of very practical ways of making dietary changes and lifestyle changes that will incorporate the things that we're talking about.
I love that. And you have a book as well.
We do. Our book, Life Change, took a lot of these things that we're talking about today. We tried to simplify it because we were trying to at least engage people in this conversation and get people that hadn't really thought about these things much to start thinking about these things. So they take these topics in a more superficial approach and at least begin the conversation. But then we point towards a lot of these other sources to really start drilling down on that further.
Excellent. So people can find out more about you and find your book on your website.
Correct.
Which is Florida Coast.
It is floridacoastweightloss.com.
Excellent. All right. Well, I want to thank you for being here today. I'm really happy we had this in-depth discussion about fat.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks to our listeners for tuning in to Energize and Revitalize with Dr. Amy. Do you have insights about this episode? Send me an email at radiantpodcast2025@gmail.com. Check out past episodes on our YouTube channel, and we're also on Apple Podcasts and all your favorite platforms. I'll be back next Saturday morning at 7:30 with more expert insights and practical strategies to help you live a radiant and healthy life. Until then, here's to your best life.